Richard, I guess it's time to get going.
Yes, sir.
And a lot to discuss. And a worrisome thing for the top news, sea levels are going apparently to rise by at least 20 feet. But this article says we can do something about it. Let's pull carbon out of the air. In technology, Domino's is going to launch robotic pizza delivery service in Houston. But unfortunately, to get it, you have to walk out to the curb. In graphene, once again, finally, 3D printed graphene aerogels can do water treatment. In space, the United Arab Republic, Emirate, is going to send a rover to the moon next year, 2022. So, says Richard, it's getting busy on the moon. First the USA, then China, and now the UAE. And Richard suggests that maybe the UAE is not prospecting for more oil.
On the moon.
Yes. In the environment, smart windows can regulate bright light in the greenhouse. Windows can do it all. And then in biology, methane-eating bacteria found in a common tree is a possible game changer for curbing greenhouse gases, specifically methane. And in us, apparently, we may trust computers more than we do other humans. And in terms of medical stuff, what is being called Biden's revamped cancer moonshot doubles down on advancing cures. So, Richard, those are what we'll talk about. And what's this in the top story, that sea levels are going to rise by at least 20 feet, but we can do something about it?
Well, the climate emergency is bigger than many experts and many of us realize. Notice I called it the climate emergency. That's new language that is starting to come forth on this issue. And so you're going to be hearing that expression more frequently in the days ahead. I like it because it expresses the idea that this is an emergency. It's not just ordinary times. Anyway, and it turns out, we are all worried about what we're doing to heat up the atmosphere. And maybe a bigger problem is the way we are heating up the oceans. And this heating up of the oceans already assures a catastrophic level of sea rise in the future. As the sea warms up, it makes the sea rise in two different ways. One, of course, is by melting the polar ice sheets. The other, though we don't think about it, but it's significant, as water gets warmer, it expands. So there's a lot of water in the ocean, and when it gets a little warmer, it gets a little bigger. And they believe now that average sea levels around the world are now all but certain to rise at least 20 to 30 feet. And they're no longer arguing about how much rise it's going to be. It's just kind of a matter of how soon. If it takes us 2,000 years, then it's okay. We'll figure out how to deal with it. But if it happens in the next 100 years or 200 years, then we are very much unprepared for that. And there could be 2 feet of sea level rise by 2040. That's 20 years from now. 2 feet or 3 feet, which would be uh, 3 feet by 2050. So we're starting to see the rise and it's starting to inch up. And 2 to 3 feet may not sound like much, but it transforms human societies around the world. An example in South Florida, for example, residents would lose all access to fresh water. And then, of course, sewage treatment plants would fail and large areas would be permanently flooded, and Miami Beach and barrier islands would be largely abandoned. That's just with 3 feet of ocean rise. Now, if it goes to 8 feet, of course, it's just an absolute disaster all over the world in any coastside community. Now, uh, the solution to these rapidly rising sea levels is twofold. The first is humans must stop putting more heat trapping gases into the atmosphere, and And I think this is significant. We must extract much of what we've already put into the air. So, carbon sequestration in massive amounts uh, has to be somehow part of our plan. And this is something that we're still actually not very good about. There's a lot of research going on, but there are few effective programs, and there are no programs in the world anywhere on the scale that is needed to be able to deal with this. One idea, some of the things that they've been working on, for example, incorporating pulverized basaltic lava into fertilizers that are used can is one thing that can take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and there you're just using something, a process you're already using, adding some ingredient to it, and that will help remove CO2. The thing is that we have to find lots of these uh, kind of programs. And uh, the uh, time is running out. You'd really have to say 3 feet by 2050 already we're going to be hurting a lot of places. If it is 8 feet by the end of the century, which it could be, then that puts New York, Washington, D.C., Shanghai, Bangkok, and places around the world. It basically destroys all of those cities. And so we this is one where we know what we have to do, which is stop putting these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But another part of it that we know that we have to do, which is to have ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere and out of the ocean water. These are still largely underdeveloped, so we don't yet have the tools that we need to do what we have to do.
Any comments?
I think for Holland, that's a big urgency because a large part of Holland is already under the sea level.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
There was a program on one of the, a segment on one of the news programs for the United States past week that talked about a program in Iceland to take carbon out of the air and using that basalt method, and because Iceland is just filled with basalt rocks and so on. And one of the key things was that the person that they interviewed said that there were a lot, yet in response to a question, yes, indeed, there are lots of places in the United States where they could use this method, where there was enough space to use that method.
Mhm.
One of the interesting things is 20 years ago, we were talking about global warming. Then we changed it to climate change. And now we're changing it to climate emergency. And you wonder, well, what can they use for the next hyperbolic descriptor to describe this? And what they really should be worrying about is the increase in political hypocrisy and politicians saying one thing but doing quite another. And an example is the Seychelles, or those islands off the coast of India that are so close to the sea level, complain loudly about rising sea levels and look for support from the rest of the world. Yet they are the largest licensor of these ocean ships that burn sulfur containing crude oil and contribute to the CO2 problem. So what's the deal?
Richard, if we want to move on, how would you like to have your pizza delivered to you by a robot? What's that about?
Now, this one is about changes happening. It turns out there's been one real effect of the pandemic, and that is that the people in the food delivery business have gotten a lot busier. Domino's Pizza, for example, in the first 3 months of uh, the pandemic, their delivery orders tripled. And it turns out, even in the best of times, it's still difficult to find enough drivers to be able to do the job. Uh, so, anyway, Domino's Pizza and Neuro, who's a Silicon Valley startup started by two ex-Google engineers who I'm sure were working on autonomous vehicles at the time. Uh, Domino's and Neuro have said they will launch robotic pizza delivery in Houston this week. And the vehicle, I don't know if you can see it here. Yeah, just flashing because this thing has, I'm sorry, that's not good enough to see the picture, but uh, it's a small vehicle, maybe 3.5 feet tall, looks like a narrow little van with a couple of lids that open up, and it goes on the streets. And uh, the thing is that Neuro has been working on this for a while, and last year it won clearance in the US to start unmanned delivery service. And so I think they're the only company that has that clearance. There may be others, but I have not heard of it. And anyway, so they're going to start delivering pizza this week. And what they will in Houston, they say it's a challenging scenario. Houston is the fourth largest city in the U.S., and Houston traffic is famous for being difficult, and Houston has more fatalities than many other big cities and all of these things. So it's not an easy environment, but they have started it, and uh, again, it won't come up to your doorstep. So you have to get out of your house and go down to the curb and pick it up. So you have to take it, it'll take it the last mile, but you have to take it the last 20 feet.
Any
And
comment?
Also, one more
Okay.
thing about this is these delivery vehicles I think of as really the frontline shock troops of general autonomous vehicles, because these things are out there on the street today actually working and having their computer driving them around Houston. And this is the way you learn about the problems, is to do it, and they're doing it, and it will, the same technology that they're learning about will end up showing in cars.
Any comments?
Yeah, well, everybody seems to think that, robot vehicles are just around the corner, but I'm very skeptical about it. I mean, these vehicles have to be insured. I mean, to drive on the roads. Are insurance companies prepared to take the risk? I mean, as soon as somebody gets run over, they're all going to be, taken off the road and things like that. I mean, I think I don't. When I actually see one, then I'll start to believe, because I think that the people who are developing these, they are kind of spreading a lot of misinformation about just how ubiquitous they're all becoming. I don't believe it.
Clive, I wonder, is it a bigger risk if it's likely that you'll have one vehicle go off the road and kill somebody, as opposed to the likelihood that if you don't do it, 50 people will get run over when things go off? Like, is there a bigger risk because it's autonomous, even if there are far fewer accidents than if somebody's driving?
But it's people's reaction to it. I mean, everybody would be a lot better at taking the AstraZeneca vaccine, but they say, "Oh no, I know it's kind of statistically it's safe, but I don't want it." And it's going to be the same with when a computer vehicle runs somebody down. All the computer vehicles are going to be attacked. It's
Yeah.
the road to acceptance is a long and arduous one.
I think that it's, as Fred said, when you start publishing statistics and say, the last months we have fewer accidents because we had more of these autonomous vehicles. So people need to be educated, but there's a lot of things that needed to be educated. Seat belts and other things. Eventually it happened for safety.
And probably this business of having low speed unmanned vehicles is probably a good way to prove the viability of the idea. And Domino's pizzas tend to be within 5 or 6 miles of every spot in the city. So maybe there'll just be little local things running around in back alleys and on the sidewalks.
How about all the street people seeing an unmanned vehicle as an opportunity for a free meal?
Good idea.
They'll have to catch it first.
Yeah.
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 Now, how one of the things that I read about as the futurists are dealing with these unmanned vehicles is they say it's likely that big early adopters will be things like cab companies in big cities. And so it won't be people driving everywhere. It will be people driving on known routes in known places. And this will be kind of the next level of the kind of user testing that they're starting in Houston. Anyway, we'll see. Also, by the way, there's a news story in the papers after this weekend of a Tesla fatality in Texas where there were two people killed, and when the car ran into a tree on a curve, and apparently none of the two people were in the driver's seat. So I think, legal action is coming.
They were in the back seat, I guess, huh?
One was in no,
back.
one was in the back seat and one was in the passenger seat. You're
Oh, yeah.
remembering your teenage years, I think.
Yeah.
Let's just stop there for a minute.
Richard, if we want to move on to water treatment in materials, what's this about using aerogels that are made out of graphene that have been 3D printed?
Now, that's actually a lot of things in one sentence that you said there, Fred, because you had aerogels, graphene, and 3D printing in the same sentence. And let's unpack that a little bit. And aerogel is a light, highly porous solid. You can think of it as similar to styrofoam, very porous and lightweight, and yet strong and resilient. And they've known for a while that graphene is great for removing contaminants from water. They just haven't been able to put graphene into a form where it was commercially viable to do that. And that now is changing. And engineers at the University of Buffalo have developed a new process where they're 3D printing graphene aerogels, and this process will be scalable. That means you can make a lot of it cheaply, and it's also stable enough to use it again and again in the water treatment. And uh, the tests that they have done with it already show that it's able to remove solvents like benzene and dyes and heavy metals like lead and cadmium from the water, and again just be reused again. And they did a trick making their 3D graphene printing ink, and that is they used a couple of bio-inspired polymers, one called polydopamine, which is a synthetic material, and it's like the adhesive secretion of mussels that keeps them next to the rock, and then a thing called bovine serum albumin, a protein derived from cows. So we have our cow parts and our muscle parts added to the graphene, and with it, you're able to make this foam gel, and that foam gel then can remove metals, organics, and solvents. They think, though, that this is not the final product that they're going to have, because they think that in addition to these materials, they can put nanoparticles of catalysts in this same foam, and have it then catalyze other dangerous and toxic chemicals while it's processing the water. And so altogether, the development of these graphene aerogels are an immense step forward in terms of being able to take bad stuff out of water so you can reuse the water again. That solves or deals with one of the major problems that is coming before us, which is the availability of clean drinking water everywhere in the world.
Any thoughts?
Aerogel is also used for improving battery efficiency. So it's really a great new discovery or invention.
Well, Richard, if we want to move on, and what's this about space and the moon and everybody sending things to the moon, like the United Arab Emirates in 2022?
Now, uh, like I was saying, the moon is getting a busy place, and besides the US and China kind of trying to out explore and colonize each other, uh, the UAE, it's hard to think of the United Arab Emirates as an international power in space, but they have decided as a part of their country's long-term strategy to use this kind of oil riches that they have accumulated to build new knowledge-based and scientific capabilities. And this space stuff is a real part of it. The UAE is a newcomer, but they've been making up ground fast. In 2019, they sent their first astronaut into space. Of course, he was a part of some other crew. They don't have any space stations yet. In February of this year, they had their HOPE probe successfully enter orbit around Mars. This is a Martian weather satellite, so they're collecting information about the Mars, and that was the first UAE interplanetary mission. And now iSpace, which is a Japanese company, is going to use Elon Musk's SpaceX Falcon rocket to next year then blast the UAE uh, moon rover uh, in to the moon and then land it on the moon, and then we will have three entities on the moon, not two. And again, one of them is one of these upstart Arab countries that is trying to figure out how to use their oil wealth to move them into the future.
Any thoughts?
I think it's good to see the one of these Arab fortunately wealthy nations kind of doing something rational with their wealth. You know, I mean,
Uh-huh.
it's that's good. I mean, it's kind of there's a need and there's a money supply, and you just got to put the people together.
Now, it's also interesting to me about this story that the UAE doesn't have any rockets. They're in this space program and extraplanetary activity without any rockets, and they're doing it all with this commercial rocket industry that seems to have grown up in the last few years. And that is, to me, is also really a fascinating part of the story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it becomes efficient that different entities specialize in providing something as cheaply as possible, and kind of for a company to specialize in launch vehicles and do it cheaply. I mean, yeah, this is innovation and probably capitalism. This is the good face of it.
I wonder how much of the technology, other than the launching ability, that is actually done in the UAE, whether they found that out too.
I think they've had a lot of help.
But it's a good way for them to motivate their own young people to see opportunities in science rather than making bombs to lob into Israel.
Yeah.
I also periodically, as I see science stories, then I see some top level science stories that are coming from the UAE. So there is substantial work that's going on there, most of which is not visible to any of us.
Mhm.
So Richard, moving on to the environment, what are these smart windows that you can put in greenhouses that regulate whatever is called right light?
Now, one of the developments that has creeped up in the last couple of years that I've seen lots of writing about, but I personally have not seen any actual examples of here in Mexico, are what they call smart windows. And these are windows that have LCD uh, elements that you can apply electricity, and for example they get lighter or darker. And so smart windows, by the way, are said to be one of the things that can be done in residential housing. And by the use of these extensively, it would decrease the energy use in a residential house pretty significantly. Because when it was too hot, the biggest way they would help is if it's too hot, they just get darker and don't let the sunlight into the house, and that doesn't heat up the house. Anyway, uh, the there are greenhouses all over the world, and greenhouses can bring productive farming into places where the areas that are otherwise unproductive. But in greenhouses, one of the actual issues that is difficult to control is the light. Because on one hand, you want to build the greenhouse to be able to maximize the light on the plant, but there are lots of places in the world where it just gets too hot and plant growth slows down in the heat. So the heat doesn't help them grow, it makes them not grow. And so growers try to solve this in several ways. One way is to increase the ventilation, so put a lot of forced air through there and cool the plants down that way. That's pretty energy intensive and has other kind of problems because when you bring in the air, you bring in the bugs. Uh, then the other way they do it is physically decreasing the light with things like curtains or shades. And anyway, these are hard to open and close and not very effective. Anyway, there is a guy, Timmerman, who has been investigating the use of smart windows in greenhouses. And what he's found is that his smart windows, one of the things they can easily do is they can become hazy or light absorbent. And so not as much light gets through in the plant. Less light means lower temperatures, and they're able to have enough light for the plants to grow well at a lower temperature, which also helps the plants grow well. In addition to that, there are a couple of other things that are kind of neat that the smart windows can do. One of them is they can generate electricity, solar power from the sunlight that is passing through them and become a significant power source for the greenhouse. And then the other thing they can do is they can alter the spectrum of the light. That means change its color, because it turns out uh, different plants have different needs for colors. For certainly for most of them, green is good. For some of them, red is good. Uh, and so these smart windows can get not only the right amount of light to the plants, but give the plants the part of the spectrum that they need to grow best. And so with technologies like this, greenhouses or these indoor vertical gardens that use sunlight can reach new kind of levels of efficiency, and I think can reach efficiencies that you can't meet in the outside where you can't control the light.
Any thoughts?
It's
I
interesting
think,
because LCDs have been around for a long time, for
Yes.
alphanumeric base. So this is a whole new application.
Yes.
yeah, I think glass is a fantastic material that has all kinds of possibilities. I mean, we've all probably been wearing transition lenses on our spectacles for the last 20 or 30 years. And
Uh-huh.
it's just fantastic the way that they regulate. I don't realize that they've gone dark until I look at a picture of myself and whatnot, Yeah. And a company who I used to live close to in England, Pilkington, they were into all kinds of development with glass. And I think most of the skyscrapers in the world have got kind of Pilkington glass inventions cladding them. Yeah.
Yes. Now, Johannes, you said LCDs have been around for a long time. Uh, my wife, Carol, had before me had a husband who was really a brilliant chemist, and uh, in the 70s, he and a little bit she kind of worked out what he called a Johnson light valve. He named it after his wife, hoping that she would like him better. And anyway, that the Johnson light valve would have been an early forerunner to the smart windows if it had ever gone into production. One of the things about this particular brilliant chemist is that some of his ideas turned out to be 20 or 30 or 40 years ahead of his time, and it's hard to do very well in business and commerce if you have these ideas too early.
Well, Richard, what's this about common trees that have bacteria that eat methane?
Well, it could be a good thing. There also are problems with this report too. And, you know, trees we think of as the Earth's lungs. But research now is showing besides absorbing carbon dioxide, trees actually can also emit methane. And methane is a much worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I've heard different numbers. This article says methane is 45 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And it turns out while we're busy wanting to plant a trillion trees, that they had known about trees emitting methane for more than 100 years, but really only a few years ago did this become of interest to the scientific community. It was really only in 2018 that there was a tree methane review published, and before that, there was little information going out to the public or the scientific community about this uh, tree methane. Now, they call tree methane treethane, so if you ever see treethane, you know where that word comes from. And in some cases, these treethane emissions are significant. Like, for example, in the tropical Amazon basin, which is the world's largest natural source of methane, about half of the methane they think comes from trees. And so they've looked at this and tried to figure out what it is about trees, and one of the things that they found is certainly trees that are growing in wet ground. Wet ground is good to support bacteria that generate methane, and you find methane coming from both the ground and the trees that grow in the ground. They also do find microorganism bacteria on the tree that generates methane. That's less than comes from the wet ground. And while they were looking at these trees and methane, they discovered on an Australian plant, a paperback tree, that these paperback trees are a home to an enormous percentage of a microbial community living in the bark that consumes methane. And on these trees, the bacteria in its bark consume about 2/3 of the methane in that tree. So, uh, what we found recently, we've discovered, is trees can be a problem. We don't yet know how much of a problem what kind of tree and what kind of environment creates, and they're madly studying that all over the world at the moment. And uh, we would like to know more about the effects of trees on methane before we plant the trillion trees, because you would like to plant trees that are good for removing CO2 and don't generate a bunch of other toxic or greenhouse gases. So it turns out also that the scientists have not been able to understand where all the methane that is in the atmosphere comes from. And it turns out treethane is probably one big source of it that we haven't known. So this is just another part of the problem that is a significant part of the problem that really we didn't even know about kind of officially until 2018. So treethane, watch out for treethane.
Any comments?
Well, all these complexities in the natural environment that we
Yes.
are trying to resolve with research and things like that. What we really need to do is cut back on population and give ourselves some time, because I mean, what they're gonna are they going to decide that the Amazon basin is a positive or a negative effect on the earth?
Well, Clive, I
Yeah.
agree that we need to cut back population to save the world. You first.
Yeah, well, yeah, I've had the operation. I've done my part.
Anyway, I joked about it, but that's part of the problem, of course.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that we were just finding out about this. And do they know whether this is natural, that the trees are,
Yes, it's natural.
it's not something that that we've done to the
No, it's
environment
a
that,
natural process.
thank you. Yeah.
And Mother Nature has been handling all of this for us for the last billion years without too much difficulty. But
Except for
just that,
occasional mass extinctions.
well, yeah. But Clive's right. If there weren't so many people, it wouldn't be a problem.
Another volunteer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Too late.
Moving on then, how come some of you people trust computers more than you do other people?
Now, when I was a young man at IBM, I quickly gained a kind of role where I was able to use my mathematical abilities and stuff like this in production control, planning material, and I quickly understood their planning system and stuff like this. And I spent time trying to train one of the older workers how to use this information that came from computers. And IBM had what they called a green sheet, a page of detailed data about each part. And I showed him painstakingly how to look at everything there and showed him that about half of the information that was there was just garbage, and he could tell that himself, and he could then do a better job of figuring out what to do next. And the computer also, based on this information, then would issue order recommendations. You need to buy some more of these. And after I spent all of this time with Mickey Dwyer and asked him then on what would you do on this part? He said, well, I would accept the computer recommendation because it knows more than I do. And this was after I showed him that the computer recommendation was based on a bunch of garbage, but he trusted the computers. It turns out that what I experienced as a young man is a little bit like what scientists are finding out now. We have algorithms in our life. If we're using computers or phones, then the they are using the algorithms to recommend stuff, to give us information that they think is will be interested in. So we're relying on the algorithms, and I like some of these algorithms because the one on Netflix or YouTube, they make recommendations to me that I never would have found on my own that are really interesting. So these algorithms can be nice, but they're all around us. And we need to understand the way that they affect us and learn how to deal with them. And so, in trying to understand humans and computers, a study was done recently where they took 1,500 individuals and they were evaluating photographs, and these were photographs of crowds, and they were asking them to count the number of people in the crowd. And in addition to their own ability to count, they also were receiving suggestions, one that would be like crowdsourced, what other people are saying, and another would be suggestions generated by an algorithm. And what they found doing this study was that as you increased the number of people, as you increase the complexity, then people stopped relying on themselves, and in this particular case, their own ability to rapidly count confusing scenes, and then they didn't use the recommendations that came from other people. They used the recommendations from the algorithm. And so this was broadly seen in this group of 1,500 individuals that when the situation became too complicated for them to handle, then they were happy to just give over responsibility to this algorithm. Now, there could be some problems with this. For example, one of the places where algorithms are used is in facial recognition, identifying people by computer, and those are notoriously famous for being inaccurate and also for having cultural and racial biases built in. So, for example, the facial recognition algorithms in America are a lot better with white folk than they are with dark folk. And so, anyway, and another place where these algorithms show up is anyway, even with the phone, with your Google searches, all of this are based with most applications upon algorithms, and the algorithms, of course, are finally designed by people, and people have the biases they have, and the biases they have are built into it. There's another place where this shows up presently. A lot of employment is presently done where the resumes are scanned and rated by algorithms. And these algorithms share the same kind of problem that facial recognition algorithms have, which is cultural and racial biases uh, built in. And so, in the case of this, when this happens in hiring, then what it means is the person who is kind of misevaluated by the algorithm doesn't ever even get to talk to a person. And so these biases aren't present in simple tasks like counting, but as the task gets more complex, then more of these biases show up. And when you're just accepting the algorithm unthinkingly, then you have just bought into the bias. So the people who are doing this kind of work say that, gee, this is something that you ought to know about and think about sometimes. Don't you think?
Any thoughts?
Yeah, there was an item on the news yesterday about the difficulties in triaging people when they come into the hospital emergency room with COVID symptoms, because they're all different ages and different conditions and have got different complications and all that. And then they were talking about all the different doctors and experts who need to be consulted and things like that before they decide what they're going to do with this patient. And I thought to myself, a computer could decide this in a split second, because the computer could have all the patient's medical records, which would include all their demographics and things like that. And, you give a few, add to the medical records, a few kind of readings, the person's temperature, etc. And the computer could make decisions, and they would be very sensible decisions. I'm all in favor of it.
So, Richard, for our last story, this is about Biden's revamped cancer moonshot, doubling down on dealing with cures for cancer. What's that?
Now, it turns out that the war on cancer, if I may use a phrase that started with Richard Nixon in 1971, the war on cancer is not a race, it's like a very long marathon. And since 1971, which is when the National Cancer Institute was started, then they've been coordinating scientific discovery and supporting researchers and been involved in a lot of significant breakthroughs through the years. But we still haven't heard about a cancer cure. Then, in more recent time, President Biden, when he was vice president, he actually had his first cancer moonshot in 2016 after his son Beau died from cancer. And this program ended up spurring 240 new research projects and over 70 cancer science programs in the U.S. And so this program generated a lot of activity, but we still haven't heard of the cure for cancer. Now, Biden is ready for his reinvigorated cancer moonshot, and he says 2021, this is going to be a top priority of his administration. And one of the things he's done is create a new cabinet level director for science and technology policy, and they will receive funding to develop a DARPA-like advanced research focus on cancer. And Biden says when Nixon declared the war on cancer in 1971, he had no army, no troops, but we're now in the position where things have changed so drastically. And I mean to make a major, major effort. And so that's the general story. If you've noticed the details of the things that I keep reporting week to week, we're getting a lot more cancer treatments and cancer vaccines and things like that are happening at a pretty rapid pace. And I think maybe the third time is the charm for the war on cancer.
Mhm.
Any thoughts?
I think with all Biden's initiatives, he's demonstrating the wisdom of electing a 77-year-old.
Let's hear it for 77-year-olds. Yes.
No, I think probably he realizes that his legacy is more important. You know, it just, you know, he's probably thinking legacy all the time, and he only intends to have one term, and he's going to do as much good as he possibly can. Yeah, it's great.
I don't know if it's legacy or if he just wants to do something,
Yeah,
that turns out later to be a legacy.
yeah.
I don't think his ego is involved. He knows he has only so many years left. He just wants to do some good things.
I think
Yeah.
so.
I think so, but Richard, I'm a little bit cautious about some of this because we talk about all of these breakthroughs, but in fact, we're doing the very same thing we were 50 years ago. We cut people, or we burn them, or we poison them. And that technology has not really changed at all in the last 50 years.
Except
Isn't that true?
you see, though, there are these flowerings of new treatment areas of, for example, vaccines that stop the growth of specific kind of cancer. Those things we were not seeing 30 years ago and 50 years ago. And like we've talked about, these changes build on each other. And you see in the beginning of the change, you just see a small kind of inflection in the curve, if you will. And that takes a long time to get to where it has some momentum. And then you see the curve bend and go up and then start shooting up steeply. And I think this is another place where we're going to see a version of this technology adoption curve that is not linear.
But some researchers are saying that all of these things will be not nearly as significant as if people stop eating sugar. But you can't have cancer without sugar, apparently.
Well, maybe if they would study this well enough so that would become a public knowledge, and then on the milk carton you would see the picture of some evil looking person and this text saying, "The sugar eater is in your town, watch out."
Yeah.
Well, Richard, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for participating. And once again, we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yep.
See
All
you.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, very good.
Thank you, Richard.
You're
Thank you, Fred.
welcome. Good
Bye-bye.
to see you. Good to see you. And see you next week.